Hi, Savi. It's so good to have you with us for this first conversation in the new Black Theology series that Inclusive Church is running. This one is called Black and Asian Queer Identities. There, I remembered it. It's quite a long title, but we're trying to go a bit more intersectional with this one. So should be really, really.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry, I should have let you jump in there. So thank you so much for being part of it and for being the first one as well to go. Very brave. And maybe you could now introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Right. My name is Savi, Savitri Hensman. I'm a British Sri Lankan, born in 1962 in Sri Lanka, Ceylon as it was then, but I've lived in the UK since I was a small child. And I've been an activist of various kinds. I'm a writer, and I've also worked in the voluntary sector, now in the university sector, in a range of positions. Should I say a little bit more about myself, my background, and how I became involved ultimately in Inclusive Church and various other organisations?
Yeah, that would be great. So you did an IC story, didn't you, recently for us? So that said maybe a little bit about how you came across Inclusive Church, I think. But it would be great for everyone that's not read that and just to anyone that has, just to repeat some of that, you know, how you came across us, how you got involved in, well, you do a lot of activism and campaigning and that, don't you? So yeah, how you got involved in all that, really.
Yeah, so I landed up with my older siblings and parents in the UK in the 1960s. And this was a time of very overt racism. So there was a politician, Enoch Powell, who was also a devout Anglican, who was perhaps one of those who gave clearest voice to some of those sentiments of fear around, and those of us from various parts of the Commonwealth, usually, largely people of African, Caribbean and Asian descent, who were arriving in the UK. Though it was a time of often open hostility and a lot of ignorance. It was also a time when sexism was very open. When I came, gay sex was still unlawful. So men were getting arrested just for having intimate relationships. And there were also fairly drastic penalties of other kinds, for instance, within the health system, that really wasn't at all adapted to a diverse community. People could just get sacked fairly easily because of prejudices of various kinds if they got hired in the first place. So it was a place with quite a lot of isms to deal with. And I think it was fairly clear to those of us who were children even, that we were not particularly accepted, though my family wasn't nearly as badly affected as some. So it was an experience where I think I and a lot of us had to work hard to feel more positive about ourselves. I mean, I was lucky in that my parents were socially engaged Christians, people who saw the link between justice and equality and the work of the Holy Spirit, are called to be people who reflect God's love in our lives, and recognition that faith couldn't just be a private experience, you know, me, my God, and I, or even something that was confined to a very pietistic kind of expression, but had to go further than that. And I think they were influenced by the burgeoning liberation theology and all those other movements, something that had been part of their background from being in Ceylon. And that was very helpful. So that provided me with at least a bit of support and an ability to think beyond perhaps some of the kinds of Christianity that might have been surrounding me. That having been said, it was still a situation of trying to work out how I and others could live with dignity in this society. And I mean, there were various things to contend with, including police racism of often a fairly blatant kind in East London. And so as I grew to adolescence, I became more actively involved in anti-racist organising and activism as somebody quite young, but alongside various other people of colour in that part of London. At the same time, as an adolescent, I was becoming more aware of being more attracted to other girls and women than I was to boys and men. And that was very much not the done thing in society in those days. We're talking about the 1970s. And certainly it wasn't the done thing in the Church of England. So again, I had to wrestle with that, with my identity, and in this case, with the question of whether I would ever be able to act on those feelings in a way that was acceptable. And as it became clearer to me that I wasn't going to be able to enter confidently into a committed relationship with a man, without being aware that it might well go awry very badly, because I'd sort of found out a bit more about same-sex love by that stage. And I've realised that it wasn't something that just vanished away with a little bit of effort or a little bit of prayer or a little bit of therapy, but that it could be quite destructive to try to be something other than who one was. But at that time there was some work being done by theologians, and it was beginning to reach popular consciousness that there was a lot of misunderstanding around what the Bible said. People were reading into it modern day prejudices quite often. This was often entangled with sexism, so passages were being read very much from a perspective of entrenched gender inequality, and so that idea that men might, quote, play the woman, unquote, or people who were born male at any rate, or vice versa, was seen as going against the order of nature, whereas actually this is God who turns things upside down, who doesn't go along with our ideas of having to have hierarchies of all kinds, of dividing ourselves into better or worse, lesser or greater. So this helped me to come to terms with my own identity. And by the time I was about 20, I had become active on issues of, at that stage, lesbian and gay inclusion in church and society, or at around the age of 20, as well as being having been involved in anti-racist discussions in the church, which could be quite volatile back in the 70s. But this was all very educational, I suppose. I joined what was then the gay Christian movement, which became quite rapidly the lesbian and gay Christian movement, and is now One Body, One Faith. And I have remained a member of that for many decades now.
Since the 70s. Has it been going since the 70s then?
See, yes, I think so. I mean, I wasn't around when it started. I would have been very young then, and yeah. I didn't come out till I was about 19 or 20. So that would have been a step too far. I wasn't out when I was at school. I came out when I was at university. I was studying chemical engineering at the time, which was an interesting experience. It's a very male-dominated course in those days. Sadly, engineering is still quite often not seen as a realm for girls and women. But anyway, I had a reasonably good time of it. I didn't experience the level of rejection that I was afraid of. I think it might have raised a few eyebrows in the Christian Union at the time, but again, I could have had a much worse time of it. And my parents, yes, my parents did accept me. So I had been afraid of my parents' reaction. And at first, they still hoped that I might go straight. They still held to that belief that the best place for expressing sexual love was between a man and a woman in marriage. But they went in for some thinking, so serious thinking. They were willing to listen and learn and find out more about the issues. And then they came to be not just accepting, but affirming. And that was sort of very important for me and for my partner when we got together back when we were in our mid-20s.
And which are we talking? 80s, 90s? Which decade are we talking here, Savi?
We're talking of the 1980s.
80s, okay.
So,
yeah, we have something in common because I also came out at 20 at university. And I think, when I think back to how, because I was there in the very early 2000s, and looking back to then, I feel like we've moved on so far as a society, and as a church, actually, although in some ways the church hasn't practically, well, the Church of England anyway hasn't moved on in terms of kind of changing actual policies and that, but I feel like the attitudes of people in the pews is so different, even to how it was when I came out. It was just mainstream to be anti-gay. It wasn't even a kind of very conservative thing. It was just mainstream. And so my parents also struggled at first, but like yours, became really affirming. So that's really, and it means so much, doesn't it? So important to have that.
Yes, and my siblings were affirming, my older sister and brother and their spouses. So that made a huge difference as well. I think I'd also say that things go backwards as well as forwards sometimes. So I came out at a time when perhaps there was an increasing recognition of the fact that some people were lesbian or gay, maybe to some extent that some people were bisexual and transgender, though there was probably even less visibility for those, especially among people of colour. There was a bit of an assumption that those of us who were people of colour were either that our sexuality and gender was kind of broadly relevant, or that we were very neatly fitting into certain stereotypes of family life and identity. So this was a challenging time for many, but there were openings coming up, and I found myself, not having got a work job in engineering, but doing various other jobs, working for the Black, Lesbian and Gay Centre project from 1985 to 94. So I was lucky enough to be working alongside many others in London. This is using an inclusive definition of Black, the one that was quite common at that time, reflective of the Black Power movement in the UK, and while recognising major differences in experience among different sets of people of colour, also areas of common ground and the need to work together to combat racism effectively, as well as with other people who were anti-racist. So I was able to make contact with others outside London as well, and work with a range of people who were very often very impressive, and some of whom I'm still in touch with. And that was a really valuable experience. I was also active in Haringey, opening up some of those possibilities, working alongside a range of other people in the council and outside. So I was one of those in the broader community.
Just one moment, Savi. I've got a very cheeky cat here that's made an appearance. Oh, you go, Daisy. I forgot to shut the door properly for it. because she will just climb all over me if we continue, and I don't put her out. So anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah, so I became active in Haringey in LGBT plus campaigning, joined the lesbian and gay subcommittee. This was a time when there was increasing recognition in some parts of local government that there was a need for greater recognition of diversity, more policies to further equality. And these were often fairly tame by today's standards, but there was a huge backlash against them. So in Haringey, as in some other areas, we found ourselves in the midst of something of a storm in the 1980s. And we became the focus, particularly of certain sections of the Conservative Party, who were pointing to us as, I suppose, examples of what could go wrong. So culture wars are not new.
Not new, no.
And there were all kinds of things said that we couldn't recognise at all in terms of the factual accuracy. But it was, I suppose, an important experience for me. And I was representing Islington and Haringey Gay Group in some activities. And the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre was initially located in Tottenham. So we were very much at the centre of things. There was a sort of a pushback against equality locally, and then there were people arguing in favour of that. There was a campaign, Positive Images, to argue that young people in schools should be given some sense of the diversity of the world around them, and Haringey Black Action campaigning against homophobia and racism, in both of which I was involved. And there was a march through parts of Haringey, and a lot of dialogue locally, as was happening in some other parts of the UK and elsewhere. I also knew from working at the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre project that there were LGBT plus people in every community, really. And in many countries, there were organisations or networks of people. And later, it became increasingly clear that a lot of church leaders had somehow missed this and seemed to take, in some cases, positive pride in I would call a pastoral failure. But then a lot of male church leaders anyway had very little recognition of, say, the needs and experiences of women and children and many others, and didn't listen very much to some of the theologians who were at work in those societies and communities. So it was a good vantage point to get a bit of a sense of some of the debates that were going on, some of that recognition that there were different ways of organising society, from, say, those of Victorian England, and that wasn't necessarily the norm for all of humankind. And I think learning from my parents that sometimes what's seen as Christian values could reflect those of a particular culture and time. So it was a time of great learning for me. I also entered into what would be a lifelong partnership with someone else who was something of an activist, Sharon Smith, as she was originally known, who later took on the name Vijayatara as a member of the Triratna Buddhist order. And we were together for 24 years until she died of cancer.
I've seen you post about her sometimes. Sadly, obviously I've never met her, but yeah, it does seem like she was really the true love of your life. And although it had a sad ending, it seemed like you had experienced that. And how did that help you through that period? Because I know that in the 80s and that, it was just an incredibly difficult time for the LGBT community, wasn't it? Did it help to have all those people around and your partner?
Yes, definitely. So there were all those bonds and shared experiences. She was somebody who was of Jamaican descent, but had been born in Britain. But there were a lot of things in common, as well as differences between us. For instance, I was from a middle-class household. She was from a working-class household. She studied chemistry. I studied chemical engineering in different places. But she also went on to be a sociologist of religion. And that was a learning point for me. I mean, she worked very much in the Buddha in terms of researching Buddhism, including engaged Buddhism and diversity within Buddhist movements. But that also gave me some insights into the value of looking at faith bodies and institutions, not simply as possibly reflecting something of the divine, but also as very human institutions filled with people who could be both wonderful and get things totally wrong some of the time. So there was a lot that I learned there, but this was certainly something I valued. And I would say we had that family life was very important, but in the broadest sense. So there was, I suppose, inherited families, and I think my parents came to see her very much as a daughter, just as I see her, a surviving sister, very much as a sister. And I suppose what might be called families of choice, or families that we pick up along the way. And for many of us who are LGBT+, these might be largely others who share that experience, or they may be friends from other places. But I'd say that family life in the broadest sense is very important, though it has its challenges, whether or not it's more traditional, in inverted commas, or whether it reflects that great diversity.
And what was your experience of this kind of intersectional nature of being both, not white, South Asian heritage, and being with someone who was Black, and both of you being, I assume both being lesbians, although I don't know that.
Yes, both being lesbians, yes.
Yeah. So how did that play out? Did you have a kind of unique experience compared to people that might only have one of those kind of discriminations? How did they play out? Did you feel one more strongly in certain places, maybe in the church more, one more than the other, or in your activism one more than the other? How did it work in terms of...
I think that there are, at varying times, different things might have come to the fore. So we were very much conscious, I think those of us who are active in LGBT plus groups of colour or networks, that we did have a different experience in certain ways from those who are white. This would range from racist immigration laws that might affect some of us to attitudes by the police or others in authority, and that would bring us together with others in our community. At the same time, our communities could be oppressive places, and as could all communities. So, which was probably something that hurt more because of greater reliance on one another in a racist society. And LGBT plus circles were not all as inclusive as they might have been either. So there were a range of different kinds of exclusion, and again, some of the men were not as clued up as they might have been around sexism. So I think just recognizing that all of us had some learning to do, and maybe together we could do some of that learning. And I think that that's also informed my experience in terms of thinking theologically, of recognizing the intersectional nature of life, and part of that is, and that's not about saying let's notch up how many oppressions we have, and oh gosh, it must be absolutely terrible to be a lesbian of color, but maybe it's not quite as bad as being. I think it's avoiding that kind of competitive spirit is really important, and avoiding looking on those aspects of our identity simply as negatives, and us as simply downtrodden, accepting we have some agency, that we have certain kinds of power and status, all of us at one time or another. This may shift in different situations. It's trying to use what we have responsibly, but recognizing that we will get some things wrong. So it's not just a case of, oh gosh, how awful, there's some people out there, they don't understand us properly, they're prejudiced. So we all have probably some measure of that, including internalized prejudices, and some things we don't fully understand about others. And so creating those spaces for learning are important. And, you know, in terms of doing theology, we do it from an embodied space. So, you know, it doesn't help to pretend that one is who one isn't. And I think that idea that somehow men doing theology in white middle class or upper class men doing theology in universities, but very often from a perspective of being heterosexual and married, so these represented some kind of completely objective view of humankind and the divine. So I think it's become increasingly recognized that it doesn't work that way, and that sometimes it's better to be aware of the different places from which we do our work, the communities that we may be part of, that may be going through certain kinds of experiences, while recognizing within those communities, people may react even to the same experience in very, very different ways and have very different views. And that the importance, above all, I think, about seeing that different kinds of oppression are interconnected. Of course, it is possible to have a certain kind of anti-racism or anti-sexism, sort of opposition to homophobia or transphobia that's fairly consumerist, or that you know, based on the fact that let's have diverse markets, and if people have enough money, we don't mind what they are. We'll cater to different tastes as long as they fit into the capitalist economy, and if not, tough. So you can get those kinds of inclusion, and but you can also get a deeper kind that looks at all those different kinds of interlinking oppressions. And that's one of the reasons why, as I'm here, I went onto the board of what's then the Lesbian and Gay Christian movement, and sort of at a certain point became vice chair and later chair. I was also in, I think, the early 2000s representing LGCM, now One Body, One Faith, on inclusive church. And it was really valuable there to have that opportunity to look at some of the different ways in which Christians, particularly in the Church of England, but also more widely, might be working together to look at a more inclusive and just church, and perhaps a more inclusive and just world. And I think that is one of the examples of looking at things in a broader sense, and maybe making some of those connections. And I think that, you know, in a world with so much poverty and preventable ill health and menaced by violence, particularly the possibility of mass violence using extremely sophisticated technology, and ecological destruction that is already affecting so many people, especially the poorest, that importance of joining up struggles comes in. And that's one of the things I think that's been emphasized by some kinds of what might be described as third world theology, that might also encompass taking on board issues that are more specifically around the experience of LGBT plus people.
Thank you, Savi. That's really interesting. And I feel like, because actually we've ended up chatting quite a long time already, which is, you see, the time really flies, doesn't it? Such fascinating subjects, and you've got so much wisdom to share. I just want to move us, I think it's quite a good moment actually to move us to the second question that I'd actually written down. We don't have to do all the questions that I've written down, but I thought, seeing as you kind of started to mention some majority work and all of that, I thought we could talk about your experiences of activism in your country of birth, Sri Lanka, and all of the South Asian activism that you still do and that you're still connected with. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
yes, so that has been a very important part of my life as well. Though I came to the UK, as I mentioned, as a small child, I remained a Sri Lankan, well, Ceylonese initially, citizen for quite a while, and retained close connections there, with family members becoming very active in a situation there that had begun to deteriorate quite badly in the 1970s, and by the 1980s had become catastrophic in some ways. But even before that, in earlier days of independence, there had been increasing ethnic divisions. There'd been some measure of divide and rule, I think, in a lot of the colonies in those days. But at the same time, I think we can't simply blame colonial rule for everything that has gone wrong since. And I think that's been important in moving away from perhaps a rather simplistic sense of, that there are some out there who are oppressors and some of us who are simply oppressed. So within Sri Lanka, there had been a growing domination by, I suppose, a government that was very anti-democratic, that tried to win over the Sinhalese majority, who were mainly Buddhist, to its cause by inciting quite strong antagonism towards an oppressive behavior towards minorities, including state violence. And then within the minority communities, especially among Tamils, there was a sort of a rebellion that grew, but that in itself took on increasingly oppressive dimensions, as sort of, you've got a kind of militarism taking hold, and a small set of men particularly, who were very much seeking power themselves in a ruthless way. So you've got a sort of a deteriorating situation, and you've got rebellion among Sinhalese youth, but that there too, sort of very often civilians, dignity and safety, and even lives became regarded as expendable. So this was a pretty drastic situation that I suppose became something that I focused on very much in my 20s as well, as the violence got worse. And then I was able to work alongside others who were Sri Lankan in sort of in human rights related activism and working for a restoration of democracy. Largely people who were on the left and also had a broad vision, perhaps, of human rights that encompass the economic and social as well as political rights, political and cultural rights. So this was an important part of who I was. I also have family members in India, and in the Indian situation, there's been a growth of the far right. So those are also important aspects of who I am, and sort of some of the learning that I've done. And I suppose there's also been the positive aspects, but also challenges of being a Christian coming from a part of the world where Christians are often part of a small minority. That both includes being oppressed as Christians, and also being able to see some of the ways in which other faiths can be both liberating and ways in which people might connect with some aspect of the divine, but also how those too can be corrupted. So it's not just in terms of Christianity that you can get patriarchal values, cruelty, the religions twisted to try to justify the actions of people who are seeking power for themselves, who may or may not be sincerely religious, but certainly get the core tenets wrong in drastic ways. So that's also been, I think, an area of learning. And of course, in the current situation in India, there's a huge threat of that things could get dramatically worse, with anything from concentration camps to mass killing.
You mean against Muslims?
Yes, I think Muslims particularly. Christians have also been targeted. Dalits have been attacked, dissidents of various kinds. So it's an extremely worrying situation. I mean, in Sri Lanka, it's pretty bad, but I think with India, especially because of the huge numbers of people and its international influence, it's a situation that's very drastic as well. And when do they have
another election in India? Do you think that he'll get back in as well?
That's one of the questions. I mean, there are various. There's a lot happening at regional levels at the moment. So in that context, especially at election time, when some parts of this movement, the Hindutva movement that distort Hinduism for its own purposes, have become increasingly open about talking in threatening and potentially genocidal terms. And I think that there's a problem where a lot of time in terms of international relationships, human rights takes second place to jockeying for advantage and trying to find partners who might assist the bigger businesses in whatever country it is, who might have the year of top politicians. So
I think that's. I mean, I'm not going to say either way what was the right thing to vote, because I do not want to go there with people watching this. But that's one of the arguments that people liked the EU for, is that they did do some stuff in terms of people in countries joining and having kind of human rights, minimal kind of amounts of human rights, I suppose. Whereas with trade deals with India and that, you're not going to go over there and say, well, we'll have this trade deal with you, but you better change your human rights records, or stop treating Muslims and Christians in the ways that you have been. It's just not going to happen, is it? So
I mean, there was talk about ethical trade policies, but I think so often with international institutions, it can become a sort of very cynical. Although the values that I express can be very cynical, and there's there is obviously concern about being seen to interfere in others people's affairs, but there is also an interference if you prop up a government that's a brutal government, and you supply them with the equipment and support that they might need to carry out brutal activities. So I think it's seeing where there are openings in terms of international alliances, and where also building alliances among peoples, among those who are seeking justice and peace, working within international Christian communities, but also other people of faith and people who are not particularly religious, but are committed to a more just and humane and sustainable world.
Yeah. And I think that actually now, when I'm looking through the questions, I feel like just naturally, or maybe it's because you had sight of them beforehand and you've thought about these things, I feel like we've actually answered most of them already just by chatting. So that's really, really, really good. And we're actually on about 45 minutes now that we've done. So I think if you could I think we'll start to wrap it up a bit, but it's been extremely interesting. I wonder if we could move to the questions around what you might suggest, where you might suggest people go for more information. Like, have you got books that you really love, or anything like podcasts, or I'm not sure if you listen to podcasts, but anything like that really that might be pertain to the things that you've spoken about, even kind of politics in South Asia and that people might be interested to know more about, anything at all really. Black theology, Black and Asian theology.
Yes, I would say that the resources that would work for people depends very much on who the person is. And I suppose there's so many different facets to my life that, as is the case for all of us, that choosing books or other resources can be hard. I don't listen very much to podcasts, though I'm aware that there are a lot of interesting things that I could that I could listen to.
I think one of the many. When you start with the podcasts,
I mean, one of the things that I would recommend is reading more about some of the different kinds of theological thinking that are going on across the world. And one of the challenges is that a lot of the material that's easiest to get hold of here, even if somebody can follow theologians' language, and they don't always write things in ways that they make them readily accessible. And one of the areas I've been doing over the years has included trying to break down maybe some of the barriers between people doing work in the field of health and social care research and wider communities. But I think that often the world is full of people who express things in ways that can be quite difficult to understand, and sometimes because they are really difficult concepts, but also it's because there's sort of a style of writing that's quite difficult, that is encouraged in certain quarters to be able to be taken seriously. But I think that there's also the problem that a lot of that, the kind of theology that gets done in much of the world, ends up, if it's done in English at all, and if it's written down at all, it ends up in broadsheets, or it might end up on websites, but it's not always so easy to get hold of. And very often people get the impression that what church leaders from certain parts of the world say reflects what everybody who is a Christian in those parts of the world thinks, which is not the case at all. Again, church leaders can play that game of divide and rule, and focusing on issues that are not the key issues for their countries, and perhaps being sucked into homophobia and transphobia. Doesn't mean that all of them are, and some of them are actually very strong on human rights, but that often doesn't get talked about in the West, because it's probably less gripping, less of a news story that such and such a bishop in such and such a place is concerned about human rights for people who are lesbian or gay, or people who are transgender, or whatever. That those who are actually quite opposed to those rights. But one of the books that I think is still quite relevant, it's rather Anglican centered, but I think it's got it's a broader interest, is Other Voices, Other Worlds. The Global Church Speaks Out on Homosexuality. That's edited by Terry Brown. And
Terry or Kerry, did you say?
Terry with a T.
Okay.
And 2006. It was published by Darton, Longman, and Todd. And it presents a range of views from different parts of the world, which tie into questions of sexuality. So it focuses mainly on sexuality rather than gender identity, but there is some relevance, I think, there as well, in terms of those broader issues around gender justice and patriarchy. But it does give a range of different voices and perspectives, so that is one of the books that I might recommend. But again, there are a lot of books on theology and LGBT plus voices. There are also a lot of books and on Asian theology, or theologies is perhaps a better way of putting it, because these come from very different perspectives, and there are a lot of people in Asia, the vast majority, the sizable majority, are not Christian, and broader theologies, African theology, Caribbean theology, and broader Latin American theology. So these are also highly relevant. So I think there's a lot of material out there, but it's looking a bit. And I think it's also looking at some of the material that deals with wider issues of justice, and how LGBT plus inclusion and justice might be seen in a broader framework of opposing oppression as a whole. I was just looking again at the Ecumenical Association for Third World Theologians 1992 statement, or if statement is the right way of putting it, which I think starts quite poetically and tries to express the cry for life of people across that part of the globe. And then 20 years later, in 2012, an Asian church leaders' theological consultation, called to prophesy, reconcile, and heal, creating sanctuaries of life for all. And the perspective there of seeing perhaps some of those issues affecting queer Asian people or queer people of colour. I'm aware not everybody likes the term queer, and I do understand that, but let's say LGBT plus people of colour, within that perspective of more generally working for a world where life is affirmed and being energised by a God of justice and love, by a Christ whose self-giving love opens the gate to a new way of living that's not based on cruelty or domination or destruction.
Amen. I feel like that's like the perfect place to end that last bit that you just said. That was absolutely like perfect. It summed it up perfectly. And I think if, you know, unless you have anything at all you want to put out there quickly, I think that we'll end there, because I just feel like that's a really perfect place to end.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So yeah, it's really wonderful to speak to you. If you want to send any of those links to me, you know, and I can maybe then share when I share this video. Video is probably an old-fashioned word anyway, whatever. But when I share this conversation on YouTube, you know, I could put links underneath. If you want to send me any of those links of those statements and things that you mentioned, you know, that could be good. I've written down the book as well. That you
Thank
said.
you. I will also include a link perhaps to Ecclesia, which I write for and which published my book, Sexuality, Struggle and Saintliness, Same-Sex Love and the Church, looking at some of the sagas around that. And also maybe a sort of oral and a local history project, Haringey Vanguard, looking at some of what went on in Haringey. And just encourage anybody who's listening and viewing to be aware that some of what you do and which you might take for granted might actually be of quite wide interest to other people. So please don't necessarily throw away all the records that you have of the things that you've been doing, and maybe you could make a note of it, have a conversation with some friends, record it, write it down, because there might well be some people who find that useful, find it inspiring in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, or maybe even sooner.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Savi. And I feel like you've got so much to share with us all as well. And yeah, I feel like already everything you've mentioned and everything you've said is going to make people want to go and research further. It certainly has made me want to go away and find out more. So no, it's been lovely having you with us, and lovely to see you again. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye for now.